All right. I think it's recording. All right. Any questions? All right. We'll come back over here now. This is where we left off. I'm going to do this a little bit here. This is an A-type proposition, an E-type proposition. And from our square of opposition, we know they're contraries. So being contraries, it can't both be true, but could both be false. So let's go back now and we'll make a truth table, which is all the possible combinations you can get. So the A-type proposition, if it's true, and the E-type proposition is true, then that can't happen. So they can't both be true and get a result that's true. So we get a false condition. Now, it is possible, however, that the A could be true and the E false. That's possible. That's a possibility. So that's our second possibility. Third possibility is A could be false and the E true, and that sort of is possible. The fourth condition is they could both be false, and that's certainly possible to happen. So we have three possibilities, three that could happen, but one that cannot happen. They can't both be true. Any question? All right. So if we have the A and the E, and this is called a wedge, let's substitute the word and for it. This wedge turned upside down, I just call it upside down wedge, means or. So it is not true that A and E can both be true. So that's what that's saying. So that takes care of that first line. All right. The second line here is taken care of right here. See, it's because that can be true. That second line that I just laid out. That'll be this right here. So we can say this or this. This would be A is true and E is not true, E is false. Or that'd be the next one. This we could have this possibility. A is not true, but E is true. And so that would be A is a second here. A is not true and E is true. And then the last one, they could both be false, that here and here. Any question? So this is your first row. And I call this the first row here. I'm not going to call the heading row a row. First row, second row, third row, and fourth row. First row, second row, third row, and fourth row. Right? Now, some of the rules for combining here, and I'm getting a little deeper into it. We're going to do this, and then I'm going to back off from it, and we'll come back to it later, right at the end of the course, because this gets somewhat technical. But what I'm trying to show here is we can prove what we are saying about the square of opposition chart. Now, when we take this, notice we only have three terms here now. What we've done is we've combined these two terms here. This has a not A and a not A. And it's similar to mathematics in factoring. So you'd have a not A and you'd have a not A. You can factor that out. You'd have an E and a not E. So when you put those together, E or not E is always satisfied. So you get a not A whenever you get through. This whole thing reduces down to just not A. That part there does. We don't have time to go into it, but that's what happens. So it becomes not A. So you got or not A, and then you have that not A then winds up being over here, right? And now then we get a not A here, me see here. This, same as this, same as this, and then this not A comes in over here, right? And then we take this, it reduces down, and we get just a not A here. And if we applied De Morgan's theorem to this part here, just to that term, we get this. We put this right here in place of this, put it over here. And when we get rid of our grouping signs, what we get, and we can take this not A and not A, those combined, they're the same. So we just got a not A. And so we reduced it considerably. And we have a not A or not E or in this right here. So we can do some more reducing now. We just have to get into the rules of how we can do that. But when we get into all of these rules, we wind up with this proposition here, which we can use De Morgan's theorem and wind up with this over here. Now, what is this saying? This is the rigorous proof of what I've been claiming. Not A or not E is true. Let's go back up to our square of opposition chart. A is not true and E is not true. They can both be false. So that's that condition right there. They're both false. Okay? And we applied De Morgan's theorem to it. All right? De Morgan's theorem says you replace an or with an and. This or gets replaced with an and you negate everything. So right here, we change the nots to trues. So the nots both drop off, the A and the E, and we negate the whole thing. And so what this does then is, this says it's not true that A and E can both be true. Okay. Now we've proven that they can be satisfied if they're both false. But now we're saying it's not true that A and E can both be true. So this is exactly what we're saying here. They cannot both be true. So we have shown the rigorous proof, rigorous logical proof. And I put it in the book so you can have it. If you get to studying this, and you study it more thoroughly, you'll see that I've proven that this part of the square of opposition chart is true. Any questions? Now then, we're going to go in and prove the bottom part down there with a quick rigorous proof. And we'll go through it. I won't go through all of the little details on it. But here are the I and the O type proposition on the bottom. The I and the O, they can both be true. This is our first line. I won't call the heading line a row rather. This is our first row. They can both be true and they can get a true result. One can be true and the other false. That's possible. One can be false, the other true. That's possible, but they can't both be false. Now let's go back up and see why they can't both be false. We'll lay this out for us right up here, okay? But I'll give you the rigorous proof of it. And if you're into this material more, you can see we've proven our case. They cannot both be false, but can both be true. Now let me show you how we can just verify it for our own good. If I is false, it automatically makes E true because they're contradictory. Any questions about that? So if I is false, then E is true. If O is false, then A is true. Why can't that be? Help me out. If O is false, A is true. If I is false, E is true. Both A and E are true, which is what? They can't both be true. So one condition we cannot have is we can't have both of these being false, the I and the O. So let's go back to our truth table down here. Can't have them both false. So if they're both false, we get a false answer. So that cannot happen. So now let's put in here, I and O are both true. I and O are true. That gets that first row right here. I and O not. It gets this second row. I not and O, it gets the third row. That's this in here. And I not, O not is not. It's false. See, that means it's false. What I've highlighted, it means it's false. All right, so we've laid that all out. Now we can combine terms. When we combine terms, we reduce them with all the rules we could use. We'll wind up with this right here. I and O or I and O not, which when we combine them again, we get I. This yields I or I not and O or not. And what I've done is I've just taken these two right here, combined them for here. That's just what I did. I didn't take the whole thing. So that this I come from this right here. That's where it comes from. And we picked up the rest of it over here, right down here. All right. So we do some more combining here. We got an I not in both of these. But we got a not here, so we're going to have to use De Morgan's theorem on it. So when we use De Morgan's, we will change both of these to affirmatives from the negation and negate the whole thing. A double negation becomes an affirmative, and the and becomes an or. And so that's what we get. So that gets us this over here. So this right here, this part right here, well, let me put my mouse over it. That part right there is what we have right here. And so with De Morgan's, we'll end up with this, I or O. Right? So now then, we have an I or this term here, or I or O. Well, the two I's combine and the O's combine, the I not drops out. We can show that if we learn more of the rules. And so we get I or O when we get through. Right? So this I or O can be true. Right? That's your subcontrary condition. I or O can be true, either one of them. And so I is true or O is true, you get a true answer. That's a subcontrary condition. Any questions? Now, let me say this. I don't know if any of you studied Boolean algebra. And I used to teach three semester hour course in college and did it for 31 years. There are certain rules. Once you learn the rules, you can just go right through this stuff real quickly. And we're not going to go into it any further. If I have time at the end of the course, I'll introduce some of it to go back and let you see the rules. This gets a little more technical than I want to get into. And this is the mathematics of how computers operate, what it is, Boolean algebra is. A friend of mine did research on George Boole, and he said that George Boole came up with this, and he was trying to use it as a proof against atheism. Anyhow, that's what I was told. All right, Chris, have you gotten in yet? All right. We have a Socrates. And this is a chain of syllogisms in which the conclusion of one becomes the premise of the next one. I'm going to back up just a few pages back. We'll come back to page 105 in just a minute. Here is one, a philosophical question. I added something to what yours has, and I'll send you the updated book whenever we get through the class tonight. What we have here is we have one syllogism. If the scriptures are true, then deism, polytheism, and pantheism are false. And then we take that conclusion, and we don't have the full syllogism here. So I'm going to put it down here. We'd have two more premises. We'd have a premise, and we would then say the scriptures are true. Okay, that'd be our second premise. We conclude that deism, pantheism, polytheism, and pantheism are false. Then we plug that in as the premise, first premise on the next argument. Any questions? So these are enthymemes that we are leaving part of these arguments out. If deism, polytheism, and pantheism are false, and monotheism is true, okay, we've already taken the position that the scriptures are true. So there's some kind of theism or belief in God because of the scriptures. You can't have an infallible book without an infallible writer of the book or source of the book. So now we come up with the scriptures themselves tell us that deism, polytheism, and pantheism are false because they teach that. The scriptures, the infallible scriptures teach that. So monotheism is true. There's just one God. And so we then draw these conclusions. We have a premise down here we have that are left out. Deism, polytheism, pantheism are false. Conclusion, monotheism is true. And so when we say if monotheism is true, notice we're taking the conclusion of one and feeding it in as into the first premise on the next one. Everyone see what we're doing? Any question? When we get down to the final end, and I put this on it, this is what I added to what you don't have. And I added this to it. The Bible, the scriptures, is the only standard of ethics for ethics and morality. Right? Now, we could change some more arguments in here on this, but that's how we draw the conclusion that the Bible is the only standard. And it's a standard that's set forth in the scriptures. And we have no other standard for right and wrong, ethics, and morality. Any question? And there are these chain arguments. There's some rules. There's two ways they construct these chain arguments. And so what we do is we have a lengthy series. Sometimes we encounter an argument that consists of a chain of syllogisms. The argument has more than two premises. Sometimes two of the premises can be combined to yield a syllogistic conclusion. That, when combined with another premise, yields a syllogistic conclusion. When combined with another, yields a final conclusion, or we can go on through them. And so Sorites is used here from the Greek word for a pile. I put the Greek word over here in it. So ros, that's your Greek word. We don't have it. I don't believe it's in the New Testament. I got another Greek source, okay? But that's where it came from, a pile. Copy says of this, with such an argument is expressed enthymemically. In other words, these arguments are enthymemes. They don't have the full argument in there. It's called a Sorites. Sorites may have 3, 4, any number of premises. Now, if you notice, premises is spelled differently. The British spell it differently than we do in the United States. So it's not a misprint, so keep that in mind, okay? Sorry about that. Some can be very lengthy. Now, how do we test one of these? We use the same procedure that we use for checking syllogisms. We test each component of it for validity. And if each component is valid, and each one then is being valid, if If all the parts are valid, then the whole is valid. Here's one that I wrote very quickly. All tigers are felines. All felines are carnivorous animals. No bovines are carnivorous animals. Therefore, no bovines are tigers. Any questions? We have one right here that has a negative in it. Right? There are two basic kinds of these. One designed by Aristotle, and then Goclenian. And they are built differently, but they both are a series of syllogisms. Now, if you want to get into it more thoroughly, we're not going to go into this real thoroughly. I want you to be aware, if you happen to see one, you need to look it over very carefully, because you get a long, drawn-out argument and they can sneak something in on you. Or they might inadvertently do it. Might not intend to deceive you, just might do it. They might think it's a sound argument. So you got to be aware of that. So the rules are each syllogism has to conform to all the rules for syllogisms. And everything we've learned up to this point. And they're intimators, so you'll have to put those unstated premises in when you're evaluating it. So each one will have to be put in the chain to be built in it to make sure they're valid. Right. Now, Aristotle's Sorites, no more than one premise can be negative. Well, that's true. You can't do that. If a premise is negative, it must be the last in his form. That's the last one. Let's go back and look at what I constructed up here. Right? The last premise right here is negative. This here is your conclusion, not premise. Any questions? Now then, let's go back here now. No more than one, and it must be the last. And so if the last premise is negative, your conclusion has to be negative. Okay, that's another rule of syllogism. No more than one premise may be particular. If the premise is particular, then it must be the first. Well, the one I presented was not, it was universal. Now here is an Aristotle type Sorites. All dictatorships are undemocratic. All undemocratic governments are cruel, unstable rather. This is Hurley's example. All unstable governments are cruel. All cruel governments are objects of hate. It may infer the conclusion all dictatorships are objects of hate. So that's a series of arguments that he makes. Now each one of these you'll have a premise that's not stated underneath here. All dictatorships are undemocratic. And what's your unstated premise? Yeah. So you got to kind of fill this all in each one. Premises are arranged so that the subject and conclusion occurs in the first premise. So all dictatorships, that's your subject, and dictatorships is in the first premise. Okay. Any questions? In Goclenian series or Sorites, the first premise contains the predicate of the conclusion. So the predicate of the conclusion in this case would be objects of hate. So it has the predicate of the conclusion in it. The common term for each successive proposition appears first as subject and as predicate. So they're reversed in order, and it's still okay to do that. But we got different forms we can have for our propositions. No more than one premise can be negative, just like the other ones. Can't have that more than one negative premise ever in any set of arguments. A premise is negative must be the first. All right, let's go back to Aristotle's. You can't have no more than one premise must be negative. Premise negative must be the last. See, here it's the last premise is negative. Right here, the Goclenian is the first premise is negative. So they're constructed differently. Be aware of that. not going to spend a lot of time on these. I want to just kind of vaccinate you with a dull needle that you see them. Only one premise may be particular. And if it's particular, it must be the last. Let's go back up to Aristotle's. Well, one premise may be particular, and premise in particular must be the first. See, so they put the negative and the particulars in different orders for the two forms. But both are valid forms. So you got to be real careful when you look at one. All sacred things are protected by the state. All property is sacred. All trade monopolies are property. Right? All steel industries are trade monopolies. All steel industries are protected by the states. Protected by the states, your predicate, that's the predicate of your conclusion. So the order of how they're arranged is different. So both of these forms are valid. Hurley says Goclea Sorites is in standard form when each of the component propositions is in standard form. When each term occurs twice, when the predicate of the conclusion is in the first premise, when each successive premise has a term in common with the preceding one. All right? Copy speaks of them, and they're in the standard form when all of its propositions are in standard form, when each term occurs exactly twice, and each proposition except the last has a term in common with the proposition which immediately follows it. All right? And that's one standard form of translation of Lewis Carroll's Sorites. Each one that is sane can do logic. No lunatics are fit to serve as on a jury. None of your sons can do logic, therefore none of your sons is fit to serve on a jury. Now the problem with this argument he has here is it's a good argument, but it's not in the standard order. And you'll find that sometimes arguments won't be put in the right order by the person making the arguments. So what he's got the terms, he's labeled 1, 2, and 3. And he's shown that the order has to be 2, 1, 3 in that order. And when we put them in this order, we can see that it's valid. All right? All persons fit to serve on a jury. Sane person, all sane persons are persons who can do logic. No sons of yours are persons who can do logic. Therefore, no sons of yours are persons fit to serve on a jury. All right? Now, he left one out there. There's one in between here. All right? What's the same person? So you got a lunatic. This is not a person who's sane. So again, you got to go in how he's defined things. Any question? Anybody? All right. Now, what we've gotten tonight is not as helpful as what we've done in the past. We'll be back with more helpful stuff in this last part of this lesson and into next week's lesson. I want to point out here, here's a truth table that's not sound. So we have 4 rows, and I won't count this top one, label PQ and P then Q row. This is our first row, second row, third, and fourth rows. How's that? I'll count. This is FP, then Q. True, true, true. True, false, true, false, true, true, false, false, true. Now, earlier editions of Copey's logic book had this unsound truth table. This truth table has been in a lot of logic books, but later editions omitted it. And what we get into here is there's a bunch of logic books that had it wrong. This truth table is not sound. The fourth row denies the antecedent. FP, then Q is your argument. FP, then Q. FP, then Q. P is not true, therefore Q is not true. Well, if you deny the antecedent, it doesn't tell you anything about the consequent. Does that make sense? So this right here denies the antecedent, which is a fallacy. And right here, let's take this row here. Now, what I've done is this, I count this your first, second, third, fourth, and fifth row for this discussion down here. So this fourth row denies P. P is not true, and it claims Q is true. Denying the antecedent doesn't tell you anything about the consequent. So this is a fallacy of denying the antecedent. The fifth row also does the same thing. It denies the antecedent as well. Because you're denying P, you're saying P is not true. That doesn't tell you anything about Q. So these two rows on this truth table are just a bunch of baloney. All right. Any questions? Most of your logic books have taken it out now. All right. But electronic computers have been designed with this false truth table built into them. So they have a flaw in them. Okay. Any questions? All right. All right. There's a certain preacher in the Brotherhood that used this truth table to try to tell me that I didn't know what I was talking about on something. And he made some absurd, ridiculous claims several years ago to me about this, and he was using Copey's book. And of course, I told him he was wrong, and he just said, well, Copey knows more than you do. Okay. But later editions of Copey's book have taken the truth table out. Okay. He took that out of his later editions of his book. Any questions? All right. No questions? Okay. Now we're going to get into some stuff that's more practical for you. Let me say this. This chapter 7. We have different forms of arguments. I don't think I've covered this yet, so we'll go into it. I go through this material over and over, and sometimes I get to wondering, have I already covered this? Because I did jump around, but I didn't jump around too much. I think my jumping around was strictly to get over to the a fortiori principle. Have I covered this? Yes or no? Do you remember? I don't think I've covered it. Okay, no answers. Okay, we're going to look at the forms of arguments. There's 3 basic forms of arguments. Arguments consist of 2 parts. There's evidence and the conclusion. That's an argument. You provide evidence, draw conclusions. The first form of your argument right here is you have your evidence stated first, and then therefore, then you draw your conclusion. The second form of the argument is you have the conclusion, and then you use the word because or something to that effect, and you give your evidence. The third form of your argument is you give some evidence, you say therefore, you draw your conclusion, and then you give some more evidence. Any question? These are the only 3 forms you can put them in. These are the 3 standard forms. Let's give a good example of these 3 basic forms. All men have sinned, and John is a man, therefore John has sinned. All right? So that's your evidence. All men have sinned. The scriptures teach that. John is a man. That's continuing more of your evidence. Your conclusion is John has sinned. All right? Any question? That fits that first form. All right? Second form. All right? Got a conclusion stated first because evidence. John has sinned. That's your conclusion. Because all men have sinned and John is a man. That's still both these arguments say the same thing. They're just in different form. Any question? third form is part of the evidence, therefore, and then you draw the conclusion and then say because gives more evidence. So all men have sinned, therefore John has sinned. So you have your conclusion, therefore John has sinned because he is a man. Part of the evidence here, conclusion, and the remainder of the evidence at the end. Again, all three of these draw the same conclusion. The computer covers up part of it, so I have to do it like that. So all three of these fit the form of these three up above. So all arguments will be in one of those three forms. So it helps to remember that, because that's the way you can figure out what the basic argument is. What you want to do is you want to put the argument in, see that it's in one of these forms, figure out what the conclusion is. That gives you two parts of your syllogism. The conclusion has your major and minor terms. And so what you have is you have those two parts. And your middle term then is what's left. Okay, so we'll come into this a little more fully. It's important to remember these three forms to be able to construct an argument and determine if it's sound. Someone makes an argument, you say, well, here's what his argument is. Then you evaluate to see if it's sound. Every argument that one makes should be evaluated before it's made in order to know that he's teaching the truth. When you're making an argument, you need to evaluate it. I don't think you should use a bunch of syllogisms in your preaching. I use them occasionally, but what you need to do is be sure that what you're saying is true. It's right. That's what you need to do. Use this to determine and make sure you're teaching the truth. Every argument that one makes should be evaluated before it's made in order that you want to know teaching the truth. Arguments a person is trying to persuade you to be carefully analyzed before you accept them as truth. Look them over carefully. Don't just swallow something. Think about it and work it out. In addition, you should remember that people don't always use words if and then in the writings of their speech. So they don't word their wordings in syllogistic forms. Several words that are substituted for the word if are in case, provided that, given that, is the case that, on condition that, it is shown by, assuming that, seeing that, it is clear from, due to, and so forth. These are just some words. I picked these up out of logic books. Okay. Several words that are used to introduce a conclusion are therefore, hence, thus, so, consequently, it follows that, we may infer, we may conclude, as a result, means that, demonstrates that, so we see that, and so forth. These are some key words that you'll run into that will help you find the conclusion. Words such as must, should, ought, or necessarily are frequently found in the conclusion of the argument as well. If a premise is indicated by whereas, it must precede the conclusion. All right? So the word whereas must precede the conclusion. All right? All right? If it is indicated by for, it must follow the conclusion. So these are some of the rules. Now let's arrange some ordinary speech arguments into syllogisms that will help us here. All right. We must make arguments made by people are rarely arranged in syllogism form. Rarely will people use syllogisms. A lot of people don't even know how to make them. And sometimes they'll make something they call a syllogism and do that in debates frequently. Some of them are just way off the wall. They follow one of three forms set forth in the above paragraph. And so let's look. Here's Levi Hedge. I think we have time to get through that. That's where we'll stop. This is a book that's a couple of 100 years old, very good, well written, by Levi Hedge. The Hedge wrote the rules of controversy that are frequently used in debates. And he is very down to earth in his approach. This is section 144 in this book. I'll cite the book here. I found a copy of the book and I made Xerox copy for myself. It wasn't violating copyright since the book is a couple hundred years old, okay? But I do have a copy of the book. I didn't find an actual printed copy. I had to make myself a copy. Every assertion accompanied by a reason why it is made contains elements of a syllogism, right? Namely, the major, minor, and middle terms. Okay, we've already studied those. Every such assertion made in the familiar formal language may be transferred to a regular syllogism by observing the following rule. First, distinguish the reason on which the attribute of the given proposition is affirmed or denied of the subject. This will be the middle term of the syllogism. Let this be taken in the most, once you got the middle term, you got half of your major and half of your minor premise. Okay? That this be taken as most enlarged sense for the subject of the proposition, to which for the predicate, unite the attribute of the asserted proposition, the major premise will be formed. Okay? All right? And unite the attribute of the asserted proposition. Next, to form the minor premise, we have only to predicate the middle term already found of the subject of the asserted proposition. So the original proposition without the reason before and next to it would constitute the conclusion. Now, you're going to give us an example here. This is pretty straightforward. It's not twisted and all like the formal logic that I gave or use symbolic logic building algebra. For example, Dr. Johnson says that envy is above all other vices consistent with the character of a social being because it sacrifices truth and kindness to very weak temptations. And he said sacrifices truth and kindness to very weak temptations is the reason why envy is pronounced above all other vices and consistent with the character of a social being. This then must form the middle term of the syllogism. The reason that's your middle term. But as this collection of words represents an attribute, not a person or a thing really existing, it cannot be enlarged so as to become a subject of a general proposition. So we got to do some fixing on it by simply placing before one of the common signs universally all or every or each. It must be preceded by some universal sign of a different sort, as whatsoever, that which, that or which, the like. So he changes the wording of it to be able to put it into a syllogism, and he changes it to that which. Say, sacrifice of truth and kindness to very weak temptations is, above all vices, inconsistent with the character of a social being. Right? And he says, envy sacrifices truth and kindness to very weak temptations. Therefore, envy, this is a syllogism, say, when he gets through with it. Envy above all vices is above all vices inconsistent with the character of a social being. Any questions? May the simple elements of reasoning, however obscure it is by rhetorical language or complicated forms of speech, be easily collected and exhibited in a regular syllogism. So, if you were having a debate, you need to be able to recognize the arguments being made by your opponent. And if you put something up he calls a syllogism, you need to be aware of whether it's valid or not. You need to challenge the validity of his argument if it's not valid. Okay? The best way to prove it's not valid, you can tell them it's not valid, but the audience may not believe you. That you can take it and show that it's not valid by constructing another argument that proves something that's ridiculous from the same form of the argument. That's a quick way to do it. And you can say it's of this form, and so you've proven your case. Now, let me illustrate this. I debated with a man named McDonald. He's dead. Debated on the role of women. I want to go back and show you what happened. Let's take the square of opposition chart. I used it in the debate, and he claimed that an I-type proposition implied an A-type proposition. Well, I said it's not true. And I went on, and he came back. Oh, yes, it is. Well, and now I have to give an illustration of it. And so the good illustration of it is some S or N does not imply that all S are N. And you need to think of something that is true about that. Because some people who believe are saved, and all people who believe are saved. Is that true? All right, see? Or some people who are humans are men. All people are humans are men. See? So you can just two or three little quick ones like that and go in and show that his reasoning is fallacious. Some humans are men, male gender. All humans are male gender. No, that's not true. See, that's a real simple one. Just do something like that, and he said, well, that's not true. So you go back and with your arguments. Any questions? I'm about through here. Yes. All right. I think we've gotten about where we need to end right here. Okay. And so we're going to stop at this point right here. Any questions? Anybody? Okay.